On a bone-chilling night just before Christmas, a naive 6-year-old girl decided to help her exhausted single mother by writing a letter to Santa in the corner office. What she didn't know was that her heartfelt words were accidentally delivered to a wealthy CEO, upwarming his heart that had gone cold for years. And only a few hours later, a knock sounded at her door. The Santa she'd been wishing for had arrived, carrying a Christmas gift far beyond anything any of them could have ever imagined. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to hype and subscribe for more heartwarming stories every day. Ashford Ridge wasn't the kind of town people talked about on postcards, but 1 week before Christmas, it looked exactly like a place where miracles were supposed to happen. Snow rolled off the green Vermont hills in slow silvery sheets, storefronts glowed with wreaths and ribbons, lights blinked along the rooftops like tiny warm heartbeats in the cold. The air carried that familiar winter mix, pine, cinnamon, and the faint smokiness of someone's old wood stove humming through the night. It was beautiful, magical, even. But not everywhere in town shared that magic. Not the run-down little wooden house on the edge of town where the wood-burning stove had given up sometime around Thanksgiving and never woke back up. That was where 6-year-old Lucy Hart sat cross-legged on the drafty wooden floor, tongue poking out just a little, gripping a red crayon like it was some kind of magic wand she hoped would change everything. Her black curls bounced every time she leaned closer to the paper. She was drawing each letter larger than the last because she wanted to make sure he could read it, whoever he really was. Across the room, her mom Marion moved quietly in the kitchenette, trying not to show how exhausted she was after another double shift at the bakery. Her black ponytail drooped over her shoulder, dusted with flour she didn't even notice anymore. She hummed under her breath, though her voice wavered every few notes from fatigue. Bills sat on the counter like little threats, rent overdue, heating oil warnings, a final notice taped to the envelope like someone shouting on paper. A small space heater struggled against the cold, blowing through the thin walls, bravely trying and failing to warm the room. "Sweetheart," Marion asked softly, "who are you writing to?" Lucy looked up as if she'd been caught performing a secret mission. Her big bright eyes flickered with excitement. "To Santa," she said. "But not the North Pole one. The one with the corner office." Marion blinked. "The what?" "The corner office Santa, the one who fixes things because he's super in charge." Lucy said this with absolute certainty because she'd overheard someone at the bakery complaining that only people in the corner office made real decisions. If people with power fixed things, then of course Santa must be one of them. Marion tried to laugh. It came out softer, sadder. "Well, tell him I hope he writes back." Lucy nodded seriously, as if signing a treaty. She bent over the paper again, and the letter came to life. "Dear Santa in the corner office, I don't want toys or candy. I want a warm house. My mommy cries when she thinks I'm asleep. She gives me the last toast even when she's hungry. She needs warm feet again. If you're real, can you help us? Love, Lucy. I am 6. She drew a tiny heart at the bottom because hearts made things stronger. She believed that. That night, after Marion fell asleep on the couch wrapped in 2 mismatched blankets, Lucy folded the letter carefully, exactly 3 times, just how her teacher taught her, and slipped it into an envelope. She wrote on the front, "Santa at the corner office, important." The next morning, the cold bit her cheeks as she and Marion walked from their little wooden house toward the bakery. Lucy spotted the shiny green mailbox outside the big glass creaky porch across the street, Sterling Holdings spelled in tall gold letters. She didn't know it was a company mail drop only, she only knew it was next to the fanciest creaky porch she had ever seen, and every fancy creaky porch had a corner office. She marched right up on her short little legs, stretched as high as she could, and dropped the letter in. It thunked loudly inside. Lucy gasped. The letter was gone forever now. Marion didn't even notice. She was too busy worrying whether their landlord would finally change the locks today. And inside that glass creaky porch, 5 floors up from the snow and the noise and the hope of a little girl, sat a corner office with lights still off. Someone would soon walk into it. Someone whose life was about to collide with Lucy's in a way neither of them could ever imagine. And it all started with that red crayon letter dropped into the wrong mailbox on a freezing December morning. The next morning at Sterling Holdings didn't begin with anything special. The office buzzed the way it always did in December. Holiday decorations taped to cubicle walls, employees juggling end-of-year reports, and that faint hum of coffee machines trying their best to keep everyone alive. But 5 floors above all that noise, the corner office still sat dim and quiet. Edward Sterling wasn't a man who rushed the mornings anymore. At 60 he moved slower, partly because of age, partly because life had carved deep grooves in him that never quite smoothed out. When he finally walked in, coat draped over one arm, the staff greeted him politely, and he returned their nods with the same distant courtesy he used every day. He wasn't rude, he wasn't cold, just hollow in a way people learned not to question. His assistant, Leah, was waiting by the door with a stack of reports balanced against her hip. "Morning, Mr. Sterling. Mail got mixed again last night. Some letters from the ground floor box ended up with us." She held out the small bundle. Edward took it without thinking. "Thank you. Just leave the quarterly summary on my desk." He said it like muscle memory, his voice flat, steady, predictable. Another regular morning. Another set of numbers to bury himself in. Another day where nothing had to be felt, until he saw it. A small envelope, child-sized, crumpled edges, red crayon handwriting. Something about it made him pause, not dramatically, just a slight hitch in his breath that Leah didn't catch before she walked off. Edward stared at the envelope for a moment longer than he meant to. Red crayon letters read, "Santa at the corner office, important." He almost set it aside, almost. But something in the uneven handwriting tugged at him with a strange, unwanted familiarity, and before he knew it, his thumb slid under the flap. The letter unfolded in one soft crackle, and he started reading. As he read, the room around him didn't just quiet, it disappeared. Lucy's handwriting, large and crooked, spelled out a truth so simple it felt like someone had torn open the locked door in his chest. "I don't want toys, I want a warm place for Mommy so she doesn't cry. She gives me all the food, even when she's hungry. Please help us if you're real. Love, Lucy. I am 6. His vision blurred before he even realized he'd stopped breathing. He read the letter again, slower this time, then a third time, as the words sank deeper, scraping places he thought had died years ago. Warm house, Mommy crying, hungry, 6 years old. He felt something shift in him, like an old machine creaking to life after decades of dust. He tried clearing his throat, grounding himself, but the paper trembled slightly between his hands. Edward Sterling hadn't let himself feel in a very long time. Not since his wife Helen passed, and definitely not since the last real conversation with his son, dissolved into shouting, silence, and a slammed door 8 years earlier. He had told himself emotions were impractical, messy, disruptive, so he stopped letting them in. But this tiny letter from a freezing little girl he'd never met had just kicked down the walls he spent a lifetime creaky porch. The first image that hit him wasn't Lucy, it was his son Michael at age 7, standing in the doorway with mittens too big for his hands, saying, "Dad, I'm cold," and Edward, younger, and too busy, answering, "Use another blanket, I'm working." He swallowed hard, the memory hurt like it had sharp edges. He pushed it away, tried to at least, but the letter kept dragging it back to him. He could almost hear Helen's voice too, soft and warm. "Ed, you forget sometimes, kids don't need perfect fathers, just present ones." He blinked, eyes stinging. He hadn't allowed himself to think of Helen's voice in years. He folded the letter once, twice, as if neat corners might help contain the emotional punch inside it. It didn't. When he lifted his head, Leah was standing in the doorway again, waiting for a signature. She froze. "Sir, are you okay?" Edward wasn't sure what she saw, maybe the redness around his eyes, or the way he gripped the letter like it might slip away. He gave the smallest nod. "Just give me a moment." Leah backed out silently. Edward stood and walked to the window overlooking Ashford Ridge. Snow drifted slowly from the sky, brushing against the glass like tiny reminders of everything he'd ignored, everything he'd missed, everything he'd lost by being too rigid, too afraid, too hurt to try again. He pressed the letter against the window gently, almost like he needed the cold behind it to steady him. "A warm house," he whispered. The words cracked something open all the way. He suddenly remembered the cardboard box still sitting in his attic, filled with toys he bought years ago, hoping someday his son would let him meet his grandson. Toys that were never given, letters that were never answered, apologies he never made. He whispered Lucy's name like he needed to hear it out loud. "Lucy, you're 6. The same age Michael was when Edward missed his first school play. The same age Helen was when her mom left home for good. The same age his grandson would be now, if things hadn't broken the way they did. For the first time in years, Edward felt something rising that he couldn't suppress. Regret, yes, but also a spark of something he barely recognized, the urge to do something right, really right, for once. He lowered the letter, holding it carefully, reverently, like it was fragile and powerful at the same time, because it was. This wasn't a normal misplaced letter, it wasn't even an accident, not to him. It felt like a knock on a door he thought was permanently locked. A second chance delivered by a 6-year-old with a red crayon. He took a breath that shook on the way out. He didn't know this girl, he didn't know her mother, but he knew exactly what it felt like to fail someone who depended on you. He knew what it felt like to lose family, and he knew, instinctively, deeply, that he couldn't ignore this letter, not like the others, not like the past, not again. He folded the letter, placed it gently in his coat pocket, and said out loud to the empty office, "I need to find her." And just like that, the most unexpected Christmas story of his life began, not with snow or music or miracles, just a little girl's plea, and a man who finally decided to listen. Edward Sterling wasn't a man who acted on impulse. For 60 years he'd built a life on structure, order and predictable outcomes. But that morning, with Lucy's red crayon plea burning a hole in his coat pocket, predictability didn't stand a chance. The moment he stepped out of his corner office, he already knew he wasn't finishing a single report today. Not when a freezing little girl somewhere in this town believed he was Santa, the kind of Santa who fixed things. He wasn't that man. He hadn't been that man in a long time. But the letter made him want to try. He reached Leah's desk, and she looked up, startled. Edward never came out once he went in. Not before noon, not in December. "Leah," he said, voice rough from whatever storm was still happening in his chest. "I need your help." Leah blinked, scanning his face like she was trying to figure out if this was some kind of test. "My help, with what?" she asked carefully. He set the envelope on her desk, sliding it toward her like it was evidence in a case he was reopening after decades. "I need to find the child who wrote this." Leah read the letter silently, her expression softened immediately, then tightened with worry. "There's barely anything to go off, just a smudged pencil mark on the back, and his street name, but no number." "It's enough," Edward said. "Start with the street. There can't be many creaky ports with mailboxes accessible to a 6-year-old. Leah expected him to delegate the task and forget about it, like every other time something emotional tugged at him. Instead, he stood there waiting, determined. She opened a map on her screen. "There's only one residence out there, a small run-down wooden house near the tree line, registered to a single mother with a young child." She paused. "Not the good side of town." Edward knew exactly what that meant. Lower income, poor heating, old wiring. The kind of place where a child might write a letter like Lucy's. Leah clicked one more time, pulling up rental records. Cabin-like room. Tenant, Marion Hart. Notes say she has a young child. She looked up, almost apologetic. "That's all I can find." But for Edward, it was everything. "Good," he said, already reaching for his coat. "I'll go myself." Leah's eyebrows shot up. "Sir, maybe I should contact them first." "No," Edward said gently but firmly. "This is personal." He didn't explain what that meant, but she understood. And maybe, for the first time since she'd started working for him, Edward saw something like respect, real respect, in her eyes. As Edward stepped into the elevator, he felt an old familiar fear rising. It wasn't fear of danger, it was fear of caring again. Fear of opening a door he'd slammed shut 8 years ago. Fear that whatever he'd lost with his son couldn't ever be fixed, and this little girl's letter had ripped that wound wide open. But he still pressed the lobby button, still walked outside into the cold, still headed for his car with a determination that didn't feel borrowed from logic or habit. It felt human, painfully human, in a way he hadn't been in so long. The drive across town was short but unnervingly quiet, the kind of quiet that magnifies every thought you try to outrun. Snow dusted the windshield, soft and slow, like the town itself was watching what he would do next. When he reached Briarwood Lane, the contrast hit him instantly. Sterling Holdings was polished glass and warm lighting. Briarwood Lane was chipped paint, a flickering thin drafty walls bulb, and a cold wind slipping through cracks in the siding. The porch steps creaked under his boots, the wood siding was warped, paint peeling, cold air slipping through every crack. It wasn't unsafe, but it carried the weary look of a place that fought a losing battle with winter every year. Edward hesitated outside the door. What was he even going to say? "Hello, your daughter wrote to Santa, and I'm here to what? Help." He wasn't used to sounding unsure, but the memory of Lucy's handwriting steadied him. He knocked, soft at first, then firmer. On the other side, footsteps shuffled, careful and wary. The lock clicked, and the door opened just enough for a woman to appear. Tired eyes, flour, still dusting the sleeves of her jacket, hair pulled back in a messy bun. Marion Hart. She looked at him like she was already bracing for bad news. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice cautious. Edward cleared his throat. "Miss Hart, my name is Edward Sterling." Her expression didn't change. His name meant nothing to her, and honestly that was refreshing. He held up the envelope. "I believe your daughter wrote me a letter." Marion's confusion shifted into alarm. "Is she in trouble? Did something happen?" Before Edward could answer, a small voice from behind her cut in. "Mommy, is that him?" Lucy peeked out from behind her mother's leg, eyes widening at the sight of the envelope in Edward's hand. "You're Santa," she said, not loudly, but with such certainty, it hit Edward harder than he expected. Marion turned, stunned. "Lucy, what are you talking about?" Lucy marched forward 2 determined steps. "That's my letter." "I know it is." She pointed at Edward like she was identifying someone in a lineup. For the first time in years, Edward laughed, not a full laugh, but a soft, disbelieving sound that felt like something unclenched inside him. "I suppose I am Santa today." Marion's shoulders softened just slightly, not trusting yet, but no longer afraid. She opened the door wider. "You'd better come in then," she said quietly. And as Edward stepped inside that cold little wooden house, something shifted, not dramatic, not loud, but real. The world he'd locked himself out of for years cracked open a little, just enough for one small girl, just enough for hope, just enough for the story to truly begin. Edward stepped into the little wooden house slowly, almost cautiously, like he didn't want to disturb the fragile warmth inside. The little wooden house was cramped, the kind where everything felt worn but loved. A tiny artificial tree stood in the corner, decorated with exactly 3 ornaments, 1 mismatched bauble, 1 paper star, and 1 cotton ball snowman. Lucy had clearly made at school. The space heater hummed loudly near the old window, trying its hardest to pretend it was a real heater. Marion closed the door behind them, her hand lingering on the knob as if she wasn't sure she should have invited him in at all. She kept her voice steady. "You said she wrote you a letter. I'm still trying to understand why that letter ever ended up with you." Edward held the envelope carefully, like it was something fragile. "It landed in one of our internal mailboxes by mistake. My assistant handed it to me during a meeting. I couldn't ignore it." Marion stared at him for a second too long, suspicion flickering across her face. "Well," she said quietly, "we don't need charity." Lucy popped up in front of them before Marion could finish the sentence, moving with the speed of a kid who already made up her mind. "Mommy, he came because he heard me. Santa always hears me." The way she said it, confident, believing completely, hit Edward in the chest like a gentle punch. It was the kind of faith he hadn't seen since his own son used to wait for him at the window, with drawings and questions and hopes that once felt endless. Edward crouched down so he could meet Lucy at her height. "Hello Lucy," he said, and his voice came out softer than he intended. "I got your letter." She looked up at him like she was inspecting him, squinting a little, assessing the wrinkles, the tired eyes, the gray at his temples. Then she nodded with total seriousness. "I knew you'd come." Marion pressed her hand to her forehead. "Lucy, for heaven's sake, he's not actually." "It's all right," Edward said gently, standing again. "Santa can look like anyone." Lucy gasped dramatically. "I knew it." Marion sighed, but there was the smallest hint of a smile tugging at her lips, just a little, but real. Edward felt something loosen inside his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time, the sense that he wasn't intruding, he was needed. "Can I see what you're coloring?" he asked. Lucy grabbed his hand instantly, and tugged him toward the little carpet in the center of the room. Marion stiffened at the sight of her daughter, pulling a stranger, but she didn't stop her. "Not yet." Edward sat on the floor beside Lucy, while she spread her papers like treasure maps. Each drawing was chaotic and joyful. Tiny houses, stick figure moms and daughters, snowmen, and something that looked like a dog, but also could have been a cloud with legs. "This one's our house," Lucy said, holding up a picture with shaky lines. "That's Mommy, that's me, and that's the cold." She pointed to the blue scribbles, drawn right over the windows. Edward felt his throat tighten. She had literally drawn the cold. Marian stepped closer, her voice low. "She draws what she feels. It's how she processes things." There was no bitterness in her tone, no self-pity, just honesty, and that honesty hit harder than any emotional speech could have. Edward nodded, still staring at the picture. "You're a very brave girl, Lucy," she beamed. "Mommy says brave is when you try even if you're scared." "She's right," he said quietly. Marian froze for a second, not expecting to hear her words echoed back with such gentle sincerity. Something in her posture softened, just a little. The room's overhead light flickered suddenly, one quick blink then another. Lucy didn't flinch, but Marian let out a breath that sounded too practiced. "It does that when the heater overloads the wiring," she said. "I've called maintenance, but no one's been up yet." Edward looked around more closely now, really looked. The peeling paint, the draft pushing under the door, the thin blankets stacked on the couch. He saw signs of struggle everywhere, but also signs of strength. They were fighting to stay warm, fighting to stay together, fighting to stay hopeful. And a 6-year-old girl wrote a letter to a stranger because she believed someone out there might listen. For the first time in a long time, Edward felt anger, not at them, but at himself, at the world, at how easily people slipped through the cracks while he sat in a temperature-controlled office. Lucy suddenly tapped his knee. "Santa," she whispered, leaning close like she was telling a secret, "are you here to help us?" Edward didn't answer right away. Marian tensed again, ready to pull Lucy back if this got out of hand. But then Edward spoke in a voice that was steady, honest, and shockingly, even to himself, full of something like promise. "I'm here," he said, "because your letter reminded me what it means to do the right thing." Marian's eyes widened ever so slightly, not trusting, but listening. Lucy nodded once, satisfied. "Good," she said. "Mommy needs someone to help fix things. She does everything, but she can't fix all the cold." The heater hummed louder, straining. Snow tapped the window in small cold rhythms. And inside that tiny little wooden house, something shifted, not fully, not magically, but the beginning of something real. The beginning of a door cracking open. The beginning of a connection none of them saw coming. And Edward Sterling, who spent years keeping people out, felt something he hadn't felt in a very, very long time. He felt pulled in. Edward hadn't expected to stay long. He told himself he'd come in, explain the mix-up, maybe offer some temporary help, and leave before the emotions got too thick to breathe. But the longer he stood inside that tiny little wooden house, the more the past began dragging him sideways, back into rooms he'd sealed off years ago. He tried to shake it off, tried to focus only on Lucy's drawings, Marian's polite distance, the draft whispering under the window. But memory has a way of slipping through cracks even tighter than cold wind. Lucy held up another picture, a stick figure man with gray lines for hair, and a big red heart floating above his head. "This one's you," she announced proudly. "I made it after Mommy said corner office people always look serious." Edward blinked at the picture, and something inside him twitched. The drawing looked almost exactly like one his son Michael had made at the same age. Same crooked arms, same too big smile, same heart that was meant to say, "Please see me, please don't forget me." He cleared his throat, but the sound came out softer, weaker than he wanted. "It's very good, Lucy," she grinned. Marian watched them from the kitchen counter, arms folded in a half-defensive, half-exhausted stance, but there was a small flicker of something else in her expression now, maybe curiosity, maybe concern. Maybe wondering why a 60-year-old CEO looked like he'd just been hit by a ghost. Edward shook himself. He needed perspective, needed air, needed to stop letting his mind trail into old wounds. But the little wooden house kept giving him reminders. There was a tiny coat hanging on a hook by the door, pink puffy, a little worn at the elbows, and instantly, unexpectedly, he saw a blue one. Not physically there, but in his memory hanging in the entryway of his old home, waiting for a little boy who'd eventually outgrow it, and outgrow waiting for his father. He stepped toward the window, pretending to look at the snow, but he wasn't seeing any of it. He was seeing Helen, his late wife, standing beside that little blue coat, saying, "Ed, you're missing too much. He won't be this small forever." And he, younger and too driven, replying, "I'll make it up this weekend. I promise." Except he never did. Weekend after weekend slipped through his fingers until the boy stopped asking. Until the boy stopped trusting. Until the boy stopped trusting. Until the boy stopped being a boy altogether. Behind him, Lucy climbed onto the couch and tugged a thin blanket over her legs. "My mommy keeps the blanket for me even when she's cold," she said casually, not knowing she was twisting a knife he'd tried to bury for years. Marian looked up sharply. "Lucy, don't say things like, 'It's all right,'" Edward said, turning back toward them. "Kids tell the truth better than adults." Marian's eyes softened, but only by a fraction. "Truth doesn't pay rent," she said. She meant it as a joke, but it landed heavier than either of them expected. The room fell quiet for a moment. Then Lucy reached under the couch cushion and pulled out a stuffed animal, a floppy-eared rabbit, missing one button eye. "This is Mr. Thump," she declared proudly. "Mommy fixed him 4 times already." Edward stared at the rabbit, and just like that, another memory surged. He once fixed a broken toy truck for Michael on a night when he finally came home early. His son had looked at him like he'd hung the moon, and that tiny spark of joy, so pure, so simple, was something Edward hadn't allowed himself to remember. But in Lucy's smile, he saw it again. That warmth, that trust, that open, unguarded belief kids have before the world teaches them caution. He sat down slowly in the small armchair, feeling the weight of every lost year pressing against his ribs. "Lucy," he said gently, "you're very lucky to have a mom who takes care of you like that." "I know," she answered instantly. "Mommy is the strongest person ever. She can lift the laundry basket with one hand." Marian snorted softly. "That's because the other hand is usually holding you." Lucy shrugged like this was the most logical thing in the world. Then, without warning, she pointed right at Edward and asked, "Do you have a family?" The question punched the air out of him. Marian stiffened, instantly apologizing. "Lucy, don't. He doesn't have to." "It's fine," Edward said. But it wasn't fine, not even close. He opened his mouth, then closed it, the truth tightening his throat. "I did," he said finally. "I lost my wife some years ago, and my son." He stopped there. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was something heavier, something that made Marian's expression change. Not pity, understanding. Because loss recognizes loss, and even without the details, she seemed to feel the pain tucked between his words. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been hard." Edward nodded. "Hard doesn't go away," he said. "It just settles." Lucy, in the way only a child can, reached out and placed her tiny hand on his. "It's okay," she whispered. "Santa gets sad too." That simple gesture shattered something inside him, not violently but gently, like a shell cracking to let light in. Marian watched, her expression shifting in a way she didn't intend to show. She saw a man who had been carrying grief alone for far too long. She saw Lucy treating him like family without asking permission. And somewhere deep inside her something loosened. Just a little. Enough to let a sliver of warmth slip in. Edward realized something too. He wasn't just seeing a struggling mother and her hopeful daughter. He was seeing echoes of his wife's gentleness in Marian's patience, of his son's childhood in Lucy's drawings, of the family he lost in the family standing right in front of him. And in that moment, painful and hopeful all at once, he understood something clearly. This wasn't just about helping a child. This was a second chance he never expected, and didn't deserve, but couldn't walk away from. Not now. Not after this. Not after seeing what he saw. Edward didn't plan the invitation. It rose inside him naturally, the way a warm breath fogs a cold window, quiet, instinctive, undeniable. One minute he was watching Lucy arrange her crayons into a perfect rainbow line, and the next he realized how cold the little wooden house felt when her little hands stopped moving. The heater buzzed harder, pushing warm air that barely grazed the room before fading into nothing. Marian rubbed her arms without realizing it, her breath just faintly visible near the window. Something inside him snapped, not in anger but in a kind of protective urgency he hadn't felt in years. He stood before he even thought about it. "Marian," he said, and his voice carried a steadiness that made her straighten instinctively. "I can help with the heating situation." Marian bristled instantly. "We're not," but he lifted a hand gently, not to shush her, just to ask for a second of space. "I know you don't want charity. And I respect that. But this isn't charity, it's a practical solution." She hesitated, torn between pride and exhaustion. "What kind of solution?" Edward took a breath, choosing each word with the careful precision of someone terrified of overstepping. "I have a guest house on my property. It's empty most winters. It's warm, safe and private. You and Lucy could stay there until the cold settles." Marian's expression froze, not shocked in a dramatic way but in the wounded, wary way of someone who's had every offer in her life come with strings attached. "You're inviting us to live on your estate," she said slowly. "Temporarily," he added quickly. "On your terms, not mine." Lucy lit up instantly. "A guest house," she squeaked, eyes widening like she'd just spotted Santa's sleigh itself. "Like a tiny little castle, with hot cocoa." Edward smiled before he could stop himself. "If you want cocoa, I'll make sure you get cocoa." Marian swallowed hard. She wasn't a woman who said yes easily. She'd built her life on doing things alone, because doing things alone meant no one could disappoint you. No one could leave. No one could break something you were barely keeping together. But then she glanced at Lucy, her cold reddened cheeks, the thin leggings she'd outgrown but still wore, the hopeful way she bounced on her toes. And something inside her cracked just a little. Not enough to break, but enough to let in the smallest sliver of possibility. "Just for a few days," she asked quietly. "Just until things warm up." "Just a few days," Edward agreed immediately. "And only if it makes things easier for you." Marian searched his face, looking for hidden motives, false kindness, anything that hinted at danger. But all she found were tired eyes and a man who looked like he carried more regret than pride. A man who strangely seemed to need this as much as they did. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll try it." Lucy shrieked with joy and sprinted across the little wooden house to hug Edward's leg like she'd just been reunited with a long-lost relative. "We're going to Santa's other house." Edward let out a startled laugh, quiet, shaky but real. Marian covered her face with one hand. "Lucy, please, he's not Santa." "He is," Lucy insisted, "because no one else heard my letter." Edward swallowed hard. That one sentence pressed deep into his chest, warming places he thought were permanently frozen. They packed quickly. Marian moved through the little wooden house with a mix of urgency and embarrassment, grabbing clothes, Lucy's stuffed rabbit, a stack of carefully folded blankets she refused to leave behind. "You don't have to rush," Edward said gently. She didn't answer. She was rushing because if she slowed down her courage might disappear. Old fear and new hope battled in her eyes the whole time. When they stepped outside, the cold hit them like a wall. Lucy's small hand clamped around Edward's without hesitation, and for a moment he saw not Lucy but Michael at the same age, running toward him after school, reaching for his hand before he stopped reaching altogether. His throat tightened, but he didn't pull away. Marian locked the little wooden house door, pausing at the sight of a thin eviction notice tucked slightly behind the frame. She quickly plucked it free before Edward could see it, stuffing it into her coat pocket with shaking fingers. He didn't notice. But Lucy did. And the look she gave her mother, a mix of understanding and fear, told a story neither of them spoke aloud. The drive to the estate was quiet at first, but not awkward. Lucy pressed her face against the window, gasping at every passing snowflake. Marian sat stiffly in the front seat, hands locked in her lap, the glow of the dashboard reflecting the hesitation in her eyes. When the Sterling estate came into view, Marian inhaled sharply. It wasn't a mansion dripping in wealth, it was something gentler, older, with tall pine trees lining the driveway and warm yellow lights glowing through the windows like lanterns guiding travelers home. The guest house sat slightly behind the main house, wrapped in ivy and framed by snow-covered evergreens. "It looks like magic," Lucy breathed. Marian shot Edward a look that was equal parts awe and disbelief. "You said guest house," she whispered. "I wasn't expecting this." Edward parked the car and stepped out, letting the cold bite at his cheeks before circling around to help Lucy down. "It's yours for now," he said. "Everything inside is ready, heat on, blankets fresh, kitchen stocked." Marian froze again. Not because she didn't trust him, but because no one had prepared anything for her in years. No one had thought ahead on her behalf. No one had ever said it's ready for you, like she mattered. The keys trembled in her hand before she finally spoke. "Thank you," she whispered, quiet, but heavy with meaning. Edward nodded. "You're welcome." As the door opened, warm air washed over them like a soft embrace. Lucy stepped inside first, spinning slowly in amazement. "Mommy, look, it's warm, really warm." Marian stepped in second, hesitant but drawn, like someone approaching a fire after being cold too long. Edward remained at the doorway, watching them with a mixture of relief and something deeper, something he wasn't ready to name. For the first time in many winters, the cold didn't feel so sharp. Something warm, something fragile but real, was beginning to take shape. A new hope, a tiny spark, a second chance breathing softly in the glow of a guest house light. The days at the guest house flowed with a kind of gentle rhythm none of them expected. Snow kept falling over Ashford Ridge, covering the world in quiet white layers, but inside the guest house, heat and laughter finally pushed the cold out. Marian cooked simple meals that filled the rooms with soft homey smells, and Lucy, unstoppable, bright, curious, treated the place like an enchanted cabin that Santa himself had gifted her. Edward visited often, never unannounced, but never distant, always bringing something small, firewood, a box of cookies, or a set of colored pencils. Lucy gasped at like they were diamonds. Everything felt warm. Not perfect, not permanent, but warm. Until the knock came. It happened on a late afternoon when the sky was turning that soft purple right before nightfall. Marian was folding laundry by the fireplace. Lucy was sitting cross-legged on the rug drawing a picture of the guest house, complete with a snowman wearing sunglasses for reasons she didn't bother explaining. Edward had just stepped in with 2 grocery bags when the pounding hit the door, sharp, fast, nothing like the gentle knocks Edward always used. Marian froze instantly, the kind of freeze that came from years of expecting bad news. Lucy looked up, startled. Edward set the grocery bags down slowly, a strange tightness forming in his chest. He wasn't expecting anyone, and no one ever came out here uninvited. Marian stood, breath hitching. Who would that be? Edward opened the door. A man stood in the doorway, maybe mid-30s, bundled in a heavy coat, dusted with snow. He looked tired, drained, like someone who hadn't slept in days. His jaw tightened when he saw Edward. "So it's true," the man said. "You're actually here." Edward blinked, the world tilting. He knew that voice. He hadn't heard it in 8 years, but memory doesn't forget your child's voice even after it grows up. "Michael," Edward whispered. Marian's eyes snapped to Edward, realization sparking in her face. Lucy grabbed her mother's hand, sensing the sudden drop in the room's temperature even though the fire was still burning. Michael stepped inside without waiting for permission. "I went to your office," he said, his tone cutting but trembling. "They told me you've been spending time here, with them." His eyes flicked toward Marian and Lucy, not unkind, but confused, hurt, protective. "I had to see it for myself." Edward's hands shook slightly. "How did you find me?" "You own half the town," Michael replied. It wasn't hard. Marian swallowed, stepping between Lucy and the tension in the room. "Do you want us to step outside?" she asked quietly, instinctively shielding her daughter. "No," Michael said quickly. "I didn't come to cause trouble. He exhaled shakily, rubbing his forehead. "I came because something felt wrong. Or right, I don't know." Edward had imagined this moment for years, his son showing up, angry, or forgiving, or anything in between, but now that it was here, the words lodged in his throat like stones. "I'm sorry," Edward finally managed. "For everything." Michael didn't answer right away. Instead, his attention drifted toward Lucy, who peeked out from behind Marian's leg like a cautious kitten. Something in his expression softened. "You're the little girl from the letter, aren't you?" Lucy nodded slowly. "Are you Santa's son?" Marian nearly choked, but Michael actually let out a small stunned laugh, the sound of someone who hadn't expected to feel anything warm in that moment. "No," he said gently, "not exactly." Edward stepped forward, voice cracking. "Michael, please, I never meant for any of this." Michael raised a hand, cutting him off. "Dad, I didn't come here to argue. I came because Mom's birthday is tomorrow." The air thinned. Edward's face went pale. Marian looked between them, not understanding but feeling the weight instantly. Michael continued, softer. I knew you'd be alone, and I didn't want that. Not this year. Edward wasn't ready for the next words. I miss her, Michael whispered. And I miss what we were supposed to be. Edward's breath caught. I do too, he said, eyes glistening. More than you know. Something unspoken pulled tight between them. 8 years of distance, grief, resentment, misunderstandings, missed birthdays, missed chances, and now a little girl's letter had cracked the silence wide open. Marian stepped aside quietly, letting father and son face each other without witnesses. Lucy climbed onto the couch, watching with wide, solemn eyes, the way children instinctively understand big moments. Michael looked around the guest house, the cozy fire, the warm blankets, the sense of peace he hadn't seen around his father in years. You're different here, he said. Calmer, softer. His voice shook slightly. I didn't know you could be like this. Edward swallowed hard. I didn't know either. Michael glanced at Marian and Lucy again. Did they do this for you? Edward answered honestly. They reminded me who I used to be, who I should have been for you. The quiet in the room was thick, emotional, not suffocating but heavy with truth. Michael stepped closer, not fully forgiving, but no longer running. I'm not ready to fix everything, he said. But maybe I'm ready to try. Edward's breath trembled, not relief, not victory, something gentler, something real. Trying is enough, he said softly. Marian exhaled shakily, a hand over her heart. Lucy leaned toward her and whispered, Mommy, did I fix something? Marian hugged her tightly. Maybe you did, sweetheart, she whispered back. Because sometimes a letter doesn't just reach the right desk, it reaches the right heart. The air inside the guest house softened after Michael's arrival, but the tension didn't vanish. It hovered, thin and crackling, especially around Marian. She moved gently, almost carefully, like someone walking through a room filled with memories she didn't belong to. For the first time since arriving at the estate, she felt out of place, not because of Edward, but because of the unexpected reunion unfolding right in front of her. She kept replaying the scene over and over, the son she didn't know existed, stepping through the door, the shock on Edward's face, the undercurrent of old hurt coursing between them. She knew enough about pain to recognize the depth in theirs. Edward noticed her silence. He'd always been observant, not the nosy kind, but the quiet watcher type, the kind who saw the way someone's hands trembled, even when their voice didn't. And tonight, Marian's hands trembled constantly. He approached her after Michael stepped outside to take a call. I'm sorry, Edward said gently. You didn't sign up to be in the middle of all that. Marian forced a small smile. You don't owe me an apology. Family is complicated. He nodded once, more than I'd like to admit, but something in his tone made her glance up. The sadness in his eyes wasn't sharp, it was worn down, softened, like a bruise that had been there too long. She wanted to say something comforting. Instead, she said nothing. Lucy climbed into Edward's lap without hesitation, tiny arms wrapping around him like he'd always been part of her world. Are you okay, Santa? She whispered. Edward's breath caught in his throat. I think I am, he said softly, for the first time in a long while. Marian watched that interaction with emotions she couldn't name, gratitude, maybe, or guilt, or something warmer she didn't dare examine. Michael soon returned, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. Dad, he said, voice steady but cautious, can we talk outside? Edward nodded and followed him out into the snowy yard. Marian stood by the window, watching father and son walk down the path under the warm glow of pine-wrapped lights. She didn't want to eavesdrop, but every step they took looked heavy. Outside, the snow muffled everything except the truth sitting between them. You look different, Michael admitted, happier, less corporate. Edward cracked a small smile. That's one way to say it. Michael shoved his hands into his pockets. I came here thinking you'd replaced us, that maybe you found some new family to fill the gap. Edward's eyes widened. What? Michael, no, I know, Michael said quickly, shaking his head. I know that now, but that's why I panicked. I didn't expect to see you with them. And then I saw how gentle you were with Lucy and it confused me, because I never got that version of you. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, the words hitting harder than he was prepared for. You're right, he said quietly. You didn't, and that's my biggest regret. Michael's voice cracked. I used to think I wasn't enough, that you worked so much because I wasn't worth coming home to." The sentence slipped into the air like a confession carved straight from an old wound. Edward stepped closer, no hesitation. "You were enough," he said, voice trembling. "I just wasn't the father you needed, and I can't fix those years, but I want to fix what's left." Snow continued falling around them, soft and silent, like the world was holding its breath. Inside the guest house, Lucy watched from the window, her little eyebrows pinched together. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging Marian's sleeve, "are they going to stop being sad?" Marian brushed Lucy's hair. "I hope so, sweetheart. Can we help them?" Lucy asked. "We helped the heater. We can help this too." Before Marian could stop her, Lucy ran to the door, shoved her boots on, and burst outside like a snowball with a mission. She barreled right between the two men and grabbed both their hands. "Nobody's allowed to be sad on Santa's porch," she declared, with full 6-year-old authority. Edward let out a startled laugh. Michael, caught off guard, looked down at the tiny girl holding his hand like they'd known each other for years. Marian ran out, mortified. "Lucy, you can't just—" "It's okay," Michael cut in, kneeling to her height. "You're right, Santa's porch should be a happy place." Lucy nodded solemnly. "Then you and Santa need to hug. Hugs fix things." Marian almost fainted from embarrassment. But Edward and Michael looked at each other in that frozen moment, something fragile and raw balancing between them. Slowly, cautiously, Michael stood and stepped forward. Edward didn't move away. Their hug wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, but it was real, shaking, quiet, full of words neither of them could say out loud yet. Marian put a hand over her mouth. Lucy grinned like she'd just saved Christmas. When they finally walked back inside, something had shifted, not fully healed, but unlocked. Michael glanced around the guest house again. "Mom," he said softly, out of nowhere. Edward stiffened. Marian blinked. Michael pointed toward a small framed photo on the mantel, Edward's late wife, smiling in the sun. "Tomorrow's her birthday," Michael said. "Would it be all right if we all visited her together?" Edward's eyes filled instantly. "I would like that," he whispered. Marian felt warmth bloom unexpectedly in her chest. Not romantic, not complicated, just human. A family stitching itself back together with small careful threads. Lucy climbed into Michael's lap as if claiming him too. "Are you Santa's son now?" she asked, proudly. Michael laughed, really laughed this time. "Yeah," he said, ruffling her hair. "I guess I always was." Marian exhaled, a long heavy breath she didn't even realize she'd been holding. Later that night, after Lucy fell asleep and Michael left to get some rest at a nearby inn, Marian sat alone by the fire, staring into the flames. Edward had offered her tea before retreating to the main house, and now she held the warm mug in both hands like it was an anchor. She'd been quiet all evening, too quiet. A soft knock came at the door. Edward stood outside, looking uncertain. "May I come in for a moment?" Marian nodded, and he stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for being so patient with everything tonight." "You don't need to thank me," Marian said quietly. Edward sat down across from her, studying her face. "You've been carrying something all evening. I can see it." Marian looked down at her tea, her jaw tightening. For a long moment, she didn't speak. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I used to have dreams too, you know." Edward leaned forward slightly, listening. "Before Lucy was born," she continued, "I was working toward my culinary degree. I wanted to open a small cafe, nothing fancy, just a place where people felt warm, safe, like they mattered." She gave a sad smile. "I had the name picked out, and everything." Marian's hearth. Edward's chest tightened, but then Lucy's father left before she was even born. And school became impossible. The cafe became impossible. Everything became about survival. She looked up, eyes glistening. "I don't regret Lucy, not for 1 second. She's the best thing that ever happened to me. But sometimes I wonder, what if I'd been given just one more chance, one more shot at the dream I gave up?" Her voice cracked, and she quickly wiped her eyes. "I'm sorry, you didn't need to hear all that." "No," Edward said firmly but gently. "I did." He sat back, quiet for a moment, then said, "You remind me of someone." Marian glanced up,
curious. My wife, Helen," he continued. "She had dreams too. She wanted to be a teacher. Elementary school, 2nd grade specifically. She loved kids, but she put everything on hold to support me while I built the business. And I never gave her the chance to go back to it. I always said next year, or when things settle down. But next year never came." His voice broke slightly. "She died without ever getting her classroom." Marian's breath caught. "So when I see you," Edward said, looking directly at her, "sacrificing everything for Lucy, working yourself to exhaustion, putting your dreams in a box you think you'll never open again. I see Helen, and I see all the chances I didn't give her." Tears slipped down Marian's cheeks.
"You deserve more than survival, Marian," Edward said softly. "You deserve your dream too." She couldn't speak. She just nodded, overwhelmed. Edward stood slowly. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a big day." As he reached the door, Marian found her voice. "Edward," he turned. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me." He gave a small sad smile. "You were never invisible, Marian, you just stopped believing you mattered." And with that he stepped out into the cold night, leaving Marian alone with her thoughts, her dreams, and the first flicker of hope she'd felt in years. Christmas morning in Ashford Ridge didn't arrive quietly. It rolled in with thick snow, ringing church bells in the distance, and that soft golden light that makes everything look like a painting someone warmed with their hands. The guest house glowed like a lantern in the early daylight, and inside it felt like the world's coziest snow globe. For the first time in years, Edward woke up with something he hadn't expected. Not stress, not dread, not the sharp emptiness that had filled every holiday since his wife passed. Actual anticipation. The kind that made him move faster, breathe deeper, almost forget his age for a second. He stepped out of his main house, holding a small wrapped box under his coat as snow crunched beneath his boots. He felt ridiculous, 60 years old and practically nervous. But nervous in a way that felt good, like the air just before a surprise. When he pushed open the guest house door, warmth washed over him. Marian was standing by the stove flipping pancakes, hair tied back, cheeks pink from the heat. Lucy was dancing around the living room in fuzzy red socks, shaking a jingle bell like she was the conductor of Christmas itself. And Michael, tall, tired but softer these days, was helping her assemble a tiny toy train she'd gotten from a thrift store 2 years ago, but never learned to fix. The scene hit Edward hard. Not painful, not overwhelming, just perfectly, quietly full. Marian looked up and gave him a smile, small, warm, natural, like she'd known him forever. "Merry Christmas, Edward," she said. "Breakfast is almost ready." Lucy barreled into him. "Santa, you came back." He laughed, ruffling her hair. "I told you I wouldn't disappear on Christmas." Michael stood and handed Edward a mug of hot cocoa. "Merry Christmas, Dad." Edward froze for half a heartbeat. It was the first time Michael said Dad without bitterness or distance. The word hit deep, landing in a place Edward thought was permanently scarred. "Merry Christmas, son," he said quietly. Breakfast became chaotic in the best possible way. Lucy insisted they all wear paper crowns she made from construction paper. Marian burned one pancake because Edward distracted her by telling a joke that wasn't even funny but somehow made her laugh uncontrollably. Michael fixed the train, and Lucy screamed like it was the grand finale of a fireworks show. And in the middle of it all, this tiny, warm, unplanned family, the grief that used to live inside Edward shifted. Not gone, but gentler. After breakfast, Michael cleared his throat. "Dad," he said, "can we visit Mom's grave together?" Edward nodded, emotion tightening his chest again. Marian touched his hand lightly. "We'll stay here with Lucy," she said, reading the moment instantly. But Lucy shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I wanna go too." Nobody expected that. Marian knelt to face her daughter. "Sweetheart, this is something very personal for them." But Lucy held her ground with the seriousness of someone far older. "She's part of their family," Lucy said. "But they're part of ours now, so we should all go." Edward's breath caught. Marian blinked back a shock of emotion. "And Michael?" Michael nodded first. "She can come," he whispered. The cemetery was quiet, blanketed in fresh snow that muffled every sound. Edward brushed the snow off the gravestone with careful, almost reverent hands. His wife's name appeared, simple, elegant, carved in stone but alive in their memories. Michael placed a small bouquet down. Edward added a pinecone wreath he'd made himself the night before, hands shaking the whole time. Without anyone telling her, Lucy stepped forward and placed her hand gently on the stone. "Hi," she whispered. "I'm Lucy. I hope you like Christmas. We're taking care of your family. They're really good." Marion covered her mouth, tears fighting to escape. Michael wiped his cheek quietly. Edward closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the softness of her words. The air felt warmer somehow, as if the woman they missed so much was listening, as if she approved. When they headed back home, something felt different. The grief no longer separated them, it connected them. It didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt like shared memory, shared healing, shared family. Back at the estate, Edward guided everyone toward the main house. "I have something for you both," he said to Marion and Lucy. Lucy gasped. "Is it a reindeer? Please say it's a reindeer." Edward chuckled. "No reindeer, but close." He opened the door to reveal a fully decorated living room, tree sparkling, fireplace blazing, stockings carefully hung, 3 of them newly added. Marion's name was stitched onto one stocking, Lucy's on another. Michael stared at them in disbelief. "Dad, when did you?" "Last night," Edward said softly. "If you're going to stay through the cold, you should feel like you belong." Marion's breath trembled. "Edward, this is too much." "No," he said, "it's exactly enough." Lucy dove onto the couch like she'd just entered a castle. Michael put an arm around his father's shoulder, hesitant at first, then firmer. Marion walked slowly to the fireplace and touched the stocking with her name, like she was verifying it was real. Edward had one more surprise. "Lucy," he said, kneeling beside her, pulling out the small wrapped box he'd carried over earlier. "This is for you." She tore it open instantly. Inside was a small silver locket shaped like a snowflake. But what mattered wasn't the locket, it was the tiny folded picture inside. A picture of the 4 of them from 2 days ago, taken when Lucy dragged them into a group hug in the snow. "It's our family picture." Lucy squealed. Edward coughed to hide the emotion in his throat. If you want to think of it that way," he said. Lucy didn't hesitate. "It is our family." Marion met Edward's eyes, and for once she didn't look afraid, or out of place, or overwhelmed. She looked home. The day ended with all of them around the fire, sharing stories, eating cookies. Lucy decorated in ways no cookie should be decorated, and letting the warmth sink all the way in. For the first time in years, Edward didn't feel like a man haunted by what he lost. He felt like someone blessed by what he'd found. And Christmas for all of them finally felt whole again. The sun slipped behind Ashford Ridge's hills early that evening, leaving the sky washed in lavender and soft gold. The Sterling estate, dusted with fresh snow, looked almost unreal, like the backdrop of a Christmas card someone spent their whole heart painting. Inside the main house, the fire burned bright and steady, filling the large living room with a glow that felt warmer than anything electricity could ever make. Lucy had fallen asleep on the rug, clutching the silver snowflake locket Edward had given her, as if she were afraid it might disappear if she let go. Marion draped a blanket over her daughter and stepped back quietly, not wanting the moment to shatter. Behind her, Edward stood at the window, watching snowflakes drift like slow-motion confetti. He looked peaceful, truly peaceful, something Marion had never seen on his face before. She cleared her throat lightly. "Edward, I just wanted to say thank you for all of this. For today, for letting us be part of something so." Her voice trailed, not knowing the right word. Edward gave a small smile, something that doesn't feel broken anymore. Marion nodded, her eyes warming. "Yes, exactly that." But Edward wasn't finished, not even close. Edward took a slow breath, almost bracing himself, then reached into the drawer of the old wooden cabinet beside the window. He pulled out a flat, sealed envelope, tied with a thin red ribbon, not fancy, not expensive looking, but the kind of envelope that held something more important than money or contracts. "Marion," he said quietly, "this is my Christmas gift to you, and to Lucy." She blinked confused. "You've already done too much." "I know," he said with a soft laugh, "but this isn't the same kind of gift. Just open it when you're ready." She hesitated, then untied the ribbon and opened the envelope. Her breath caught. Inside was a deed, a property deed, for a little storefront on Maplebend Street. The old bakery space she walked by every time she finished her shift downtown. The one with the faded yellow awning she always glanced at, but never admitted out loud she dreamed about. The title read, Marion's hearth, bakery and coffee house. Her knees almost buckled. "Edward, what is this?" "It's yours," he said simply. "A place to start the dream you gave up. A place you and Lucy can build something that's actually yours." She stared at him, speechless. But Edward wasn't done. He pulled out a second paper from the envelope. A simple handwritten agreement signed by both Edward and Michael. At the top, family partnership contract. He explained gently, "Michael will oversee the renovation with my team. I'll help fund it until it stands on its own. But the business, every recipe, every decision, that's all you. And Lucy gets to be official cookie tester, apparently." From across the room Michael gave a sheepish shrug. "She insisted," he said. Very seriously, Marion pressed a hand to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. "Edward, I can't accept this. It's too—" "No," Edward interrupted softly. "You don't understand. This isn't charity. This is something I should have done a long time ago." He swallowed. "I spent years creaky porch things that made money. Then I spent years losing things that mattered more than money. But helping someone build something they love, that feels right. And you deserve something that feels right." Behind them, Lucy stirred, rubbing her eyes. "Mom, why are you crying?" Marion knelt, pulling her daughter into her arms. "They're happy tears, sweetheart. Very happy tears." Lucy looked up at Edward with that unfiltered 6-year-old honesty. "Did Santa bring Mommy a present too?" Edward chuckled, voice catching a little. "I guess he did." Lucy gasped dramatically. "Santa at the corner office strikes again." Michael shook his head with a smile. "She's not going to stop calling you that." Edward laughed. And for the first time, it didn't sound hollow or restrained. It sounded alive. But there was still one more thing, one last ribbon to tie around this strange, healing, unexpected new family. Edward turned toward Michael. "I have a gift for you too." Michael frowned. "Dad, no, you really don't need to. This one isn't something you can touch," Edward said. "It's something I should have said years ago." He stepped closer, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I'm sorry, Michael, for all the years I treated grief like a job, for shutting you out, for drowning in silence and dragging you into it with me. You didn't deserve that. You deserved a father who fought to stay connected, and I didn't fight at all." Michael blinked hard, jaw clenching. "Dad," Edward continued, "I'm not asking you to forget those years, but I'm asking for a chance to make better ones." Michael inhaled sharply, and then slow, trembling, honest. He stepped forward and hugged his father. A real hug, not stiff, not forced, a hug years overdue. Marion turned away slightly, giving them a moment, wiping her cheeks in silence. Even Lucy stood still, watching with awe instead of her usual bouncing enthusiasm. When the two men finally pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. Edward exhaled. "All right, that's my gift." Michael shook his head. "No, that's ours, both of us." They settled back around the fire. Marion and Lucy curled on the couch. Michael sank into the chair beside them, and Edward sat across from all of them, taking in the sight, like it was the final scene of a movie he never thought he'd get to see. The flames crackled softly, snow drifted past the windows. No one rushed, no one worried, no one felt like an outsider anymore. It was quiet, it was whole, it was family. And as the night deepened, Edward whispered almost to himself, This is the best Christmas I've had in decades." Lucy heard him and grinned sleepily. "It's because you didn't ask for toys, just love. And Santa always brings the right thing." Everyone laughed, soft, warm, grateful, and in that moment, it felt like the entire world breathed out with them. A final gift, a full circle ending, a Christmas that healed everything.